The rain had stopped the previous evening, and by mid-morning the barnyard was a sheet of brown standing water working its way toward the low corner of the lot. Walt Keene was inside the old dairy barn with the county assessor and a banker named Phil Greer when the water began to appear. It came from the north wall, at the base of the limestone foundation, from a gap between two courses of fitted stone, a thin, clear stream, not dripping, not forcing, running. The assessor touched the wet floor with the toe of his boot. "Foundation leak," he said. Phil Greer looked at his property file. Is there a well on this property?" The assessor checked his listing sheet. "No well of record," he said. "No pond either." A mason named Dale Pruitt, who had come along to look at the barn's structural condition, crouched at the base of the wall and ran his hand along the wet stone. "Water's getting through that wall," he said. "Leave it, and the whole north corner will move." Walt was standing behind the three of them, looking at the water. It was clear. The barnyard outside was brown mud. The water at his feet was clear. He did not say anything. They thought the water was destroying the barn. Walt had not yet understood that the barn had been built to carry it. 3 months earlier, Walt Keene had not owned this property or any property. He was 47 years old, had spent most of his adult working life in farm machinery repair, and had been running 14 calves on a neighbor's leased lot on month-to-month terms that had grown uncertain. He wanted to build to 24 head and needed a place to do it. He did not have enough money for ground that was priced at what it was worth. The 41 acres in Ozark County, Missouri, had been on the market for 18 months. The listing described an old dairy barn built around 1922, 16 acres of hay ground, 12 acres of rough pasture, and a farmhouse foundation with no structure standing above it. The county record was explicit: no well of record, no pond, barn foundation of uncertain structural value. The price was $18,500. Walt put $4,200 down and borrowed the rest. After closing, he had $2,600 in cash and a property that the bank and the county had both described, with reasonable accuracy, as having no water. A well driller from the next county had walked the ridge behind the barn and quoted $7,800 to $9,400 for a drilled well, with no assurance of strong flow in that limestone ground. Walt did not drill the well. He moved 14 calves to the barn lot and started fencing. The first heavy rain came 6 weeks after he bought the place. He was at the north wall with a flashlight the morning after, looking at the clear water on the floor, when Dale Pruitt arrived with his estimate. Dale had been doing foundation and masonry work in that part of Missouri for 20 years. He was practical and knew stone. He tapped the wall in 3 places, examined the joint where the water was entering, and wrote his numbers on a clipboard. Excavate along the north foundation, $2,400. Concrete seal and drainage gravel, $1,850. Replace the disturbed stone facing, $780. Total, $5,650. He recommended doing it before winter. Walt did not sign the estimate. He told Dale he needed a week to think. For the next 7 days, Walt kept a bucket at the base of the wall. The bucket held 1 gallon. He marked the time every morning and evening and wrote the numbers in a pocket notebook. The flow was not dramatic. At its strongest, after the first 2 days, the water was filling the bucket in approximately 40 minutes. By the end of the week, the yard outside had been dry for 4 days. The mud had firmed, and the water at the wall was still running. He put his hand in the bucket. The water was cold in a way that rainwater left in a bucket in June was not cold. He found an old dairy thermometer hanging on a nail inside the barn and measured both. The rain barrel at the corner of the barn read 63 degrees. The water from the wall read 52. He began looking more carefully at the inside of the barn. Along the north wall, at a height of about 3 feet from the floor, was a stone shelf. It ran for approximately 8 feet before ending, where a newer block repair had interrupted the old stonework. The shelf was shallow, maybe 10 inches deep, and worn smooth in a way that suggested it had held things regularly for many years. Above it, iron hooks had been set into the mortar. Most were rusted, and one had broken off at the wall, but the pattern they formed was deliberate and evenly spaced. Below the shelf, the floor showed a shallow channel cut into the old concrete, roughly 4 inches wide, running from the wall toward the center of the barn at a slight grade. The channel ended at what had been a drain opening, now packed with decades of old straw, dust, and iron debris. Walt found the notebook in the hayloft, in a tobacco tin nailed to a rafter that he'd opened looking for something to patch a hole in the loft floor. It was a ledger, small, with a water-damaged cover, and the writing inside was in pencil, in a hand that was consistent and practiced. Dates, numbers, gallons, cream pickup schedules, equipment notes. He found 3 relevant entries. The first read, north wall cooler cleaned, screen replaced. The second, spring box pipe slow, cleared oak leaves. The third, and most direct, can set in wall water, before morning truck. Walt sat in the loft for a while with the notebook. The barn had not been leaking for the first time. The farm had simply forgotten the name of the water. He told Phil Greer at the bank that he was not going to seal the wall yet. Phil told him that if the barn was assessed as a structural liability, the property value could be revised downward and the insurance position might change. Walt said he understood and thanked him for the call. At the feed store, a man Walt had known for several years told him he had bought a barn with water running through it. A neighbor named Frank Doyle, who ran a small cow-calf operation 3 miles west, said he couldn't water calves with a bad wall. Someone else at the co-op said a spring belonged outside a barn, not under it. They were all saying things that would have been correct if the water had been going where they thought it was going. Walt began clearing the floor drain. This was where the first real problem started. The drain had been packed for long enough that the material inside had compressed and partially cemented. When he broke it loose with a narrow bar and pulled the debris out, a slug of silt and rust-colored water backed up through the old channel and spread across the barn floor. Dale Pruitt stopped by that afternoon and looked at the brown water on the floor. "There," he said, "you disturbed the foundation." A piece of stone facing fell from the north wall 2 days later. It was not a load-bearing stone. It was part of an outer course that had been poorly repointed at some earlier time and had been working loose for years. But nobody standing in the barn that morning had a way to know that from the outside. The flow from the wall dropped after Walt cleared the wrong section of the drain, going from 1 gallon every 40 minutes to something closer to 1 gallon every hour. He spent 2 evenings trying to understand why and could not figure it out. He began to think the whole thing was a drainage problem and not a spring at all. The calves refused the first trough he set up. He had run water from the wall into an old galvanized trough that had been in the barn when he bought it, and the trough had rust scale on the bottom and an accumulation of old straw and dead insects that he had not cleaned out thoroughly enough. The calves walked to the trough, put their muzzles near it, and walked away. Frank Doyle drove past, saw the calves standing away from the trough, and said, "Even the calves know better." Walt nearly called Dale and signed the estimate. He did not for one reason. He had been measuring the water temperature every day, and the temperature had not changed. Regardless of whether it was running fast or slow, regardless of what he had disturbed or not disturbed in the drain, the water was 51 to 53 degrees. Rain runoff percolating through soil and stone did not stay at 51 degrees in late June. He called the extension office and asked if anyone could recommend a retired mason who had worked with old farm water systems. A man named Chester Vaught came out on a Saturday morning. He was in his late 60s, had spent his working life doing stone and foundation work throughout the Ozarks, and had seen spring houses, milk rooms, and what he called cooling walls in old dairy operations across 3 counties. He walked through the barn twice without saying much. He looked at the shelf, the hooks, the channel, and the blocked drain. He ran his hand along the wall at the point where the water entered, pressing the stone in several places. "You don't want to seal this," he said. He walked outside and looked at the hillside behind the barn. The ground rose gently to a limestone outcrop about 60 feet back. A line of elderberry ran along the slope below the outcrop. "Water's coming out of that seam," Chester said, pointing at the rock face. "Limestone seep follows the bedding plane right into the foundation." They went back inside. Chester spent an hour with a narrow probe rod and a flashlight working along the base of the north wall without removing any stone. He found what he was looking for at the eastern end of the shelf, where the old stonework had been partially obscured by a later concrete repair. With Walt holding a light and Chester directing, they carefully removed 4 stones from the outer facing, working from the sides to avoid disturbing the structure above. The stones came out cleanly, set without mortar in the old style. Behind them was a fitted stone chamber, roughly 2 feet square, with a thin sheet of water running along its floor. The chamber had a rusted iron screen frame at its inlet, facing the direction of the hillside's seep. The outlet ran to the buried channel in the barn floor. At the chamber's overflow point, an old clay tile had carried excess water to the lower side of the barn. That tile had been blocked by root intrusion and silt over a period of years, which was why the water had eventually found its way through the wall joints instead. Chester stood back and looked at it. "Springboks," he said. "They built the wall around it. Water came in from the hill, ran through here, kept the temperature at the shelf constant, and drained out through the tile. Cans sat on that shelf or in the channel water before the morning milk truck came." He looked at the iron hooks above the shelf. "Hung the cream cans there to drain after washing," he said. "The wall was not failing because water had found it. Water was coming through the wall because men had once built the wall to carry it." Walt replaced the clay overflow tile with modern perforated pipe and gravel, cleaning back 6 feet into the hillside to reach undisturbed material. He replaced the iron screen with stainless mesh. He repointed the stone facing around the springboks with appropriate mortar and reseated the 4 stones Chester had removed. He cleaned the barn floor channel, lined the section near the drain with small stone, and replaced the drain cover with a removable grate. He set an old stone milk can in the cooling water while he worked, partly to test the purpose and partly because he wanted to see it done. By the next morning, the water inside the can was 51 degrees. He ran a polyethylene line from the overflow channel to a used 300-gallon storage tank outside the barn's east wall, connected by float valve to a clean stock trough in the calf lot. Total cost of the restoration, including Chester's time, the pipe and screen materials, the repointing, the used tank, the poly line and fittings, and the gravel, $2,143. He had not spent $5,650 to seal the wall. He had not spent $9,400 to drill a well. The summer turned dry in July. The flow from the springboks dropped from approximately 1.5 gallons per minute after restoration to just over 1 gallon per minute during the driest weeks. This was not a failure. It was a limestone seep responding to reduced groundwater input, which was what limestone seeps did. Walt added a second float valve to the storage tank and began watering his calves in 2 groups, instead of all at once, letting the tank recover between uses. He cleaned the screen on the springboks every week. He did not try to use the spring for anything beyond the calves and a kitchen garden row he'd planted near the barn. He kept the overflow going into the tank and not running to waste. Frank, Doyle's neighbor to the east, began hauling water by truck in the second week of August at $38 a load. A shallow pond on Frank's own place dropped to a puddle at the center by the end of the month. Walt checked the storage tank at 5:30 every morning. It had refilled overnight, not all the way. In the worst week, it was coming back to about 60% of capacity by morning. That was enough for the calves, managed the way Walt was managing them. On an afternoon in late August, Frank Doyle stopped at the barn and Walt showed him the springboks. Frank put his hand in the cooling channel. "That's colder than the well at my house," he said. "It was cooling milk before either of us was born," Walt said. Walt went to the bank in September with a folder. He brought the dairy ledger with the springboks entries. He brought Chester Vaught's written inspection report. He brought the temperature records he had kept since June. He brought the weekly flow log. He brought the restoration receipts and photographs of the springboks before and after. He brought his calf sale tickets from the previous week, 16 heads sold, at an average net return of $410 a head. Phil Greer looked through the folder without hurrying. He found his own prior notation in the file. No well of record. Barn foundation questionable. He looked at the photographs of the spring box. He looked at the temperature record. He looked at the dairy ledger. He was quiet for a moment. Still no well, he said. Never was, Walt said. Phil looked at the photographs again. Then what do I call it? Walt pointed to the ledger entry. What the old ledger called it, he said. The north wall cooler. Phil wrote in the file. Walt did not see exactly what he wrote, but when the updated property description came back the following week, the notation read, spring-fed utility barn with documented stock water source, restored cooling chamber. Dale Pruitt came by in October to look at some fence Walt was setting on the property line. He walked through the barn and looked at the restored section of the north wall. He stood at the spring box for a while. If I'd poured concrete where I told you, he said. Water would have found another stone, Walt said. Dale looked at the wall for another moment. Probably under the wall, he said, and went out to look at the fence. The county had not lied. There was no well on the property. The bank had not lied. Water was coming through the barn wall. Dale Pruitt had not lied either. If water had been forcing its way through a foundation built to keep it out, the barn would have been in serious trouble. But this wall had never been built to keep water out. It had been built to bring water in. Before electric coolers, before pumps and pressure tanks, before the county began keeping water records, cold spring water had entered that stone chamber, passed along a shelf of milk cans, and left through a clay drain on the lower side of the barn. The drain had closed. The ledger had gone into a tobacco tin in the hayloft. The record had disappeared from the county file. The water had not. The county saw no well. The bank saw a leaking foundation. Walt saw cold water still running after the rain stopped. And by August, that wall was watering calves again. If you've ever found a spring house, cooling room, or old water system built into a farm structure, leave it in the comments. These systems are still out there, and most of them are still working.